Thanks, Rhea. You only read the first 3 pages of my resume. I expected you to read like 22 pages of stuff. So thank you all for being here. And we have really enjoyed over the last really 8 or 9 months since the start of this project. And what I'm going to do, Emily and I are going to kind of divide this up. I'm going to talk to you about Relocal, where it comes from, what it is, kind of how it works. And then Emily's going to talk about specifically what we did, what we looked at here in Little Rock. Here's the good news and the bad news. Our client is the city, and this afternoon at 4 o'clock, we're presenting to the board of directors kind of the findings. So we can't give you all of the data, but 4 hours from now you can find out whatever you please. So that's kind of what it is. So and I particularly thought this was important being here at the Clinton School is, you know, I've been an economic development consultant in preservation for 30 years. And I teach one class at the University of Pennsylvania in the spring. And I'm not remotely an academic, but I learn way more from my students than they ever learn from me. And this issue of right-sizing cities was not something that I knew about, cared about, was clueless about it, until simultaneously at 2 different universities, it emerged as a thesis topic of grad students. One, Kara Bertrand at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, wrote her thesis on what was the role of historic buildings in right-sizing efforts. And at the same time, Emilie Evans, who also, subsequently I met through Kara, was at Columbia basically writing her thesis on the same time. So those of you who are grad students to think that you know, what, I just have to do this stupid thesis so I can get my degree. In fact, it's oftentimes much more than that. And it really was these graduate school efforts that got this whole process going. So kind of to start out the kind of definition of stuff. There's been cities, particularly in the northeast, in the Rust Belt, that for 50 or 60 years, in fact, have been shrinking in population. And for 50 or 49 of those 50 years, their strategy was, oh, next year everybody's coming back. Well, they finally figured out that ain't the case. That's not going to happen. And so this approach called right-sizing has kind of emerged, and here's the kind of industry definition: readjusting a city's, shrinking city's built environment, its buildings and infrastructure, to match its current and projected population and development trends. Well, you hear that, you hear right-sizing and shrinking cities, and you think about Detroit and Cleveland and those giants, and Buffalo, and that certainly is some of them. But in our research about shrinking cities, we learned something different than that. Between the 2 censuses, 454 cities in the United States, over 20,000, in fact, lost population. Only 5 of them were cities over 500,000 people. The most of them, over half of them, were cities, in fact, between 20 and 50,000 people. And it's not just the Rust Belt in the Northeast. 41 states, in fact, had cities that shrank in population over that time period, including places that we think of as growth states, like California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, in fact, had shrinking cities within them. And here's where, again, we learn on the road, and this was really the case in Little Rock, is that there's also some instances where the city itself is growing, but neighborhoods or neighborhood areas within the city is shrinking, and so these same kind of right-sizing tools are necessary. So our response, my capitalist side said, well, if cities are finally doing this, and preservation ought to be part of it, but isn't, which is basically the conclusion of both Emily's and Kara's thesis, then maybe there's an economic opportunity to help cities trying to find out how should we spend scarce resources. So Kara Bertrand, I hired her, and we set up something called the Rightsizing Cities Initiative. We had no idea what that was. Only thing we had was a title. And so we spent a year really doing a lot of traveling, doing a lot of reading, asking a lot of questions about what these cities were doing. And then we got an opportunity to do some research for the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent national agency that basically advises the national government on preservation issues. And they were starting up kind of research area into right-sizing, so we jumped in and said, can we help you right-size? So we spent a year trying to figure out what we could do, and what we ended up with is a tool called Relocal that we subsequently then applied here in Little Rock. And it is a database tool that looks at a whole range of areas, and we'll talk about some of those, to help, initially to help municipalities prioritize their expenditure of scarce resources. And so here's kind of how the process works. We first gather a whole bunch of information. Some of that's from national databases, some of it's from local information, tax records, foreclosure rates, whatever. And then a field survey out in the streets, and Emilie will talk about that. And then we kind of organize that data into 8 broad categories that I mentioned. We have about 75, 78 metrics that we use. And then we weigh those metrics based on the community survey. That part of it, we didn't want to kind of pretend we're the experts. We come into the town and have all the answers. We have a framework, but we want those, that approach fine-tuned based on what the neighborhood feels. And we did that here in Little Rock. And then based on all of that, we go down and make recommendations on a parcel-by-parcel basis for every vacant building, every vacant lot in the targeted area. And in the area here, there were about 8,000 parcels, a significant number, and Emilie talked about it, both vacant land and vacant buildings. And then, because we don't want this to be in the abstract, we have specific recommendations on those in an implementation strategy, that for this property and this situation, here are some tools to use, here's some strategies to approach it. So that's kind of the whole process. I said that these metrics are in 8 broad categories, and here they are: environmental, walkability, stability, real estate, economic opportunity, 8 of them. And I just want to give you a flavor of the kinds of metrics in each of those. So in the environmental chain, and each of these have 8 or 10 or 12, are there brownfields? Are there floodplains? What's the tree cover in the area? Is there noise pollution? And again, some of these we can get from national data sources, some from local. In the economic opportunity, things like aggregate household income. Are there employment centers in the neighborhood? Is there immigrant in-migration, which, current political discussions aside, is a precursor to an emergence of environmental activity? So we think it's a major test. Are there at-home businesses? On the real estate, what's the foreclosure rate? What's the diversity of unit size within the neighborhood? What's happening in real estate sales? What's the share of vacant buildings? And then this issue about community engagement. So we look at things like, is there a neighborhood association, and how often do they meet and how many members do they have? Are there senior organizations? Are there third places in the neighborhood where in fact people congregate? And what's the voter registration and voter participation? On the fiscal side, what's the density? And that has huge impacts in terms of kind of fiscal responsibility. What's the relationship between demolition and rehabilitation? How much property tax is generating? What's the value of the infrastructure? We're a firm that for 30 years has been kind of viewed as an historic preservation firm, and we are. But out of these 75 or 80 metrics, no more than 5 or 6 of them have anything to do with historic preservation. And we kind of look on a much broader kind of good urbanism scale, and our secret plot, I'll confess to you, is that we think that if neighborhoods are measured on this kind of broad-based objective standards, that in fact, more often than not, it's going to be the historic neighborhoods that emerge. Issues of stability, what's the share of owner occupancy, what's the crime rate, what's the long-term residence, it certainly adds stability, what's the population change, and what's the nature of that. And then the kind of neighborhood character, and this is the one place where preservation things come in. Are there design guidelines in the neighborhood? What's the level of maintenance of public spaces? Is there public art? What's the quality of the building stock? So some of this we can get from data sources, national or local. Others just absolutely requires people on the ground talking about it, measuring this stuff. And then this issue about both walkability and proximity, a major issue in terms of increasingly in terms of good neighborhoods where people want to be. So are there bike routes in the neighborhood? What's the walk score? Most of you probably know this, but you go on your computer and type in walkscore.com, type in any address in America, and it'll give you a score from 1 to 100. 100 being the most walkable, 1 being the most automobile dependent. So we do walk scores for every block in every area so we can get a kind of composite walk score. Are there schools in the neighborhood? What's the public transportation? Is it available? And so based on all of this data, we make kind of neighborhood level conclusions. But then we start drilling down. So part of this, and many of you are involved in the field survey. Again, Emilie will talk about the specifics of it, but where we use a smartphone database system to go and answer some specific questions about every parcel, and there are 8,000 of them here in Little Rock, every parcel. And then based on that field survey, then we can go to the issues of kind of neighborhood stability and down to the property level recommendations. And then for every vacant building, and again, we only deal with vacancies. If a property is occupied, we don't want to be in the business of playing Monopoly and saying, oh, you have to move here across the street or down the hall. No, if it's occupied, it's occupied. So we're only dealing with vacancies. So there's going to be, each parcel will identify property. Empty building will fall into one of 4 categories. One is to rehabilitate and reuse. One of them is to stabilize and wait. Mothball it, so to speak. One is to raise and recycle the materials. We're a preservation firm, but there's going to be if there's more supply than there is demand for the intermediate term, some has to go. That's all. And then a chunk of deferred decisions, because we think that in our end categories, that is demolish on one end, rehabilitate on the other, that's probably going to realistically take all the resources that are going to be available for the next 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 years. And so it's perfectly appropriate to kind of wait and see on some of those properties that in fact those decisions may change the equation on that neighborhood level 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. On vacant lots. Again, same kind of 4 broad categories, that this is a lot where there ought to be infill construction. In some, there ought to be environmental reuse, like a drainway or green field or something. Sometimes a contributory reuse, something like a side lot split or a park. Or then, again, a deferred decision. So these vacant buildings will have one of these 4, we call them opportunity categories. For each of those, we suggest 3 or 4 or 5 strategies that might be used, and then a handful of tools that the city or others might use for implementation, the kind of parallel on vacant lots. Our original objectives was this, that we recognize particularly where places are shrinking. In fact, the need gets larger while the resources get smaller. So to help, how do we use effectively those scarce resources? What are the appropriate tools? This is not about writing off neighborhoods. It's that different neighborhoods or different tools are appropriate for different neighborhoods. And then when demolition comes, and there needs to be demolition, it's done on a strategic rather than an ad hoc basis. I don't want to say anything about here in Little Rock, but in many places, what happens is a city council member will show up one morning at the public works director and say, I'm tired of looking at that place, go tear it down. Well, it's not that something doesn't need to be torn down, but that decision needs to be made in a broader context, and that's what we hope Relocal will do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emilie to talk about specifically what we did here. When she's done, both of us will take whatever questions that you want to answer. Thanks.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what we did here in Little Rock. It was a really fantastic project, and we're so happy that we got the chance to work here. Thanks to the City of Little Rock and to the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, Quapaw Quarter Association, our other partners, Preserve Arkansas and others. And so I'll give you an overview here, oh, that's hard to see, of the study area and its sub-areas. Now, I know there are no streets and names on that map, totally my fault, so I will tell you the boundaries. But what we basically did was the big outline there is our study area. In that study area are about 8,000 parcels, I think 7,880 to be precise. And we actually So the city, our client, picked that study area for us. It's an area that you may be familiar with. You're looking at kind of downtown up here on the above North Central there, coming down. That's Capitol Ave on the top, coming down around the Hanger Hill there. I-30 is down here on the east side, coming under railroad tracks, Forsh Creek, coming up the railroad tracks behind Central High, and I-630 along the north there. So that study area was divided into 5 sub-areas: west, east, central, north central, and south. And the purpose of the sub-areas, again, that was chosen by our client, but the purpose of the sub-areas, and actually I should say the reason we call them sub-areas is because we recognize that they're not necessarily along neighborhood boundaries. So we don't want to call them neighborhoods, so we're recognizing that they're sort of sub-areas whose boundaries were chosen with intention. And the goal of the sub-areas is so that we are able to see what's going on in distinct areas within the study area and compare those against what's happening at the city level, but also compare them to each other. So we're able to see what's happening across the study area by looking at different sub-areas and how they're performing as compared to one another and the city as a whole. So, Don did a comprehensive job in explaining this, but I'm gonna reiterate just a couple of points that I think are really important about Relocal. And so, there's 74 metrics that we used in Little Rock across 8 categories, and that's Relocal is a comprehensive tool. It's meant to take a comprehensive look, as Don expressed. And so we have 74 metrics that we used here in Little Rock. The reason for the variation in metrics is really based on local data set availability. So we use national, state, county, and city data sets. So just looking at what's available locally in order to make the determinations of what metrics we use. But there's a very strong core consistency among our projects. And so, within categories that include walkability, economic opportunity, engagement, real estate, we've got metrics that range from immigrant and migration to sidewalk condition to tree cover, public transportation access, a whole host of metrics that really are aimed to help get a broad sense of what's going on in order to make really strategic decisions on the ground. And we are outsiders, and I think that in some ways really does benefit Relocal. We're coming in with a data-driven approach to working in cities and helping make strategic decisions. But we recognize, as Don said, we don't have that local knowledge, and so it's really important for us to engage locally in different ways that I'll go into because that's the core of how we're going to be effective, is to make sure that we're meeting local need and engaging locally. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the data sources that we used, to measure things like property values and sales over time, transportation and housing affordability. We look at a whole range of data sets. And some of these are local, some of these are from national and state data sets, and we track down each one and measure each one individually. For the city and county specifically here in Little Rock, we had, and I don't see him here, but Brian Minyard, who's an urban designer with the city of Little Rock, was instrumental in helping us get the data sets that we needed locally. And if he didn't have them himself, he put us in touch with the people who had them, and that was absolutely incredible. So for things like property taxes, property values, unit sizes, we looked at the Pulaski County Assessor's Office data set. We used Housing and Transportation Affordability Index to look at affordability. Infrastructure lines, road outlines, were all provided via the Pulaski County or Area GIS database. Economic integration and demographics information was all garnered from the U.S. Census and the American Community Survey. And then the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics dataset, LEHD for short, helps us get small business information. So a whole lot of different data sets are used to really get at all of the Little Rock, all of the Relocal metrics, and then specifically here in Little Rock. And then, of course, to learn more about neighborhood associations, senior and youth organizations, which are part of our engagement category, it was an awesome opportunity to speak with a lot of really cool and very passionate local advocates here on the ground and in our study area. And so we wanted to learn, which organizations were active, how often did they meet, how many people were coming to those meetings, what were the concerns that they focus on in their meetings. And so that was a really excellent opportunity to gather data in that regard as well. And then, as I mentioned, community engagement and local engagement is really, really important, and we do that in two kind of primary ways: the field survey and the community priority survey, both of which Don talked a little bit about, but I'll go into a little bit more of the specifics here in Little Rock. So, our smartphone field survey is really key to Relocal. It gathers data on current conditions around the built and natural environments. So we're looking at things like architectural character and building condition, and I'll go into a few of the specific metrics in a minute. But we're also gathering information about the vacant buildings and the vacant lots. So this is where we're really gathering some of that primary core information that helps us determine which properties we're going to ultimately make recommendations for. And so we engaged 50 volunteers here on the ground. We put out a call for volunteers through our partner organizations, and we had lots of respondents, 50 of whom were able to come through. That included preservation professionals, students, but also included IT professionals, travel agents, real estate agents. It was just a lot of fun, and it was a really great opportunity to talk with folks. And I know that there are a few of the volunteers here, and I won't point you out, but I hope you had a good time. And those volunteers were armed with a field manual. So they had lots of pictures and the possible answers to the questions that they would face out in the field with them. They also received extensive training before they hit the field. And then we armed them with an FAQ sheet. So really equipped them with something to hand out to residents who are naturally going to be curious about what's going on, why people are out there surveying. And so that included both contact information for me, but also the opportunity for them to be engaged if they wanted to via the community priority survey. And so, to execute the field survey, we use a smartphone platform. And this smartphone survey platform is, we use a company called Local Data. They are a small startup out of California, just 3 really passionate people. And this survey platform is web-based, so it's not an app. You actually use it through your browser on your phone or your tablet, and so it provides a super customizable way to get at the data and the metrics that you're looking to measure. And it looks essentially like Google's satellite view with the parcel boundaries of every parcel within our study area overlaid. So you can actually tap on each parcel, make sure you're looking at the same building that you're seeing on your screen, answer a bunch of questions, hit submit, and that parcel actually turns a specific color so that if all of us are out there surveying, I'm going to see that you already surveyed that property and I'm not going to duplicate that. So, and hi, I know you surveyed. And so that was an opportunity for us to reduce the number of duplicates. And so what did we do? We surveyed nearly 8,000 parcels in 4.5 days with these 50 volunteers. And the first thing that we did was take a picture of the property. So you just hold your smartphone up and take that photo. And then the first question is there a building on the property or not? If there is, it leads you to a few questions about architectural character. What is the building condition? And whether it appears occupied or not. If there's not a building on the property, it will ask you questions, or questions appear around what is the parcel being used for? Is it a parking lot? Is it a vacant lot? Is it a park or a garden? Or maybe it's someone's side lot that they acquired a while back, but it's still considered a separate parcel in the database. And then we're gathering all kinds of other information, like Don mentioned, about public art, graffiti. Is the property being rehabbed? Is it for sale? Is it open and in need of boarding? So there's a whole lot of really interesting pieces of information that you can gather out there that are not necessarily about preservation, but about so many other features of a city or a community that really do help inform decision-making going forward. And so I'll actually diverge for just a second to talk about that, because these rapid mobile surveys are really taking off. We use Local Data as our survey platform for Relocal, and of course Relocal takes a much bigger comprehensive look, but these rapid mobile surveys are increasingly becoming a way that cities and communities, planners, land banks are mobilizing locally in order to gather data in the field about current conditions and kind of what's going on the ground. And they really provide an excellent, so these are all again, local data is what we use, but there's others out there that are really interesting and a really great opportunity to mobilize locally. And so this type of survey really does provide an opportunity to marry data collection efforts with innovative community engagement strategies and to partner with other entities, from code enforcement officials to Department of Transportation, land banks, planning or community organizations. So I just wanted to say that this is really becoming a really exciting tool that's being utilized across the country. But back to Little Rock. Another vital community data source and community engagement opportunity is the Community Priority Survey. And the goal of the Community Priority Survey is to help us understand which qualities local residents value most in their neighborhoods, and that informs the overall analysis of Relocal. So the Community Priority Survey asks respondents to rate how important proximity is to things like banks or schools, pharmacies, and it also asks them how well they feel their neighborhood is meeting local needs. Is there affordable housing for seniors? Do you feel safe? Are there grocery stores nearby? So it's both a measure of what's important, but also a measure of how well the neighborhood in which that respondent is living is meeting their needs. So in Little Rock, we actually received 200 responses, over 200 responses, in fact. The survey was distributed digitally, so our local partners blasted that out, put it on social media. But we also had printed copies available at all of the neighborhood resource centers within our study area, and with a lot of notification that they were there, so that people could walk over and fill one out on the spot, and we would collect them later, or were able to fill it out digitally on a SurveyMonkey platform. And the results of the Community Priority Survey are then folded back into that neighborhood analysis to inform the weighting of Relocal metrics. So if walkability is really extraordinarily important in one sub-area or multiple sub-areas, all of that goes back into weighting on the back end for the analysis, so that we're thinking or we're understanding that there's a bigger and a greater valuation of that particular metric or of the metrics within that area. Say walkability. And so, as Don mentioned, all this analysis results in parcel-level recommendations for every vacant building and every vacant lot. And I think that that's really important to hammer home. I'll go into a few of our stats that we learned from here, but that's a lot. And so we're looking at the sub-area level, but we're looking at the parcel level, what's going on there, but we're also looking at the block level. So we're really taking in kind of multiple perspectives when we're thinking about what makes sense to do with this vacant property over another. And so with each recommendation comes strategies, as Don said, as well as tools. Those are both tools that are already in existence here locally, or either at the city, state, or national level, but they're also a series of tools that are composed of best practices from around the country to serve as an opportunity to see what other cities and other municipalities are doing to address similar issues and to get at similar results. And so for buildings, we've got rehab and reuse, bringing buildings back online. Stabilization and mothballing, I feel like those are, we talk about mothballing and preservation all the time, but I don't want to take for granted that that's a given understanding. So stabilization and mothballing really means that we see this vacant building and we understand that it has a value, but right now we may not have the funding to bring that building back online, or the market around it may not be quite ready to sustain that level of investment and make the project viable. So we need to keep it watertight, we need to keep people and animals out, but we recognize that we want to keep that building standing, whether it plays a role in a more stable block, or whether it's a particularly high architectural character or some other reason, that's what stabilization and mothballing means. And then raise and recycle with an emphasis on material reuse through deconstruction, as well as deferred decision, which Don outlaid there before. And of course, vacant lot recommendations, infill. Infill can be new construction. Infill can also be moving a building that maybe is sort of a good building in some way structurally or architecturally, but it may may not be viable necessarily where it is. You move a vacant building and use that as infill as well. That's an option. Contributory reuse, pocket park, farmers market, as Don was saying, environmental reuse, blue-green infrastructure, stormwater management, that kind of a thing, and defer decision. And so let's get into a few of the findings. As Don mentioned, we can't fully tell you all of the things that we learned quite yet, but stay tuned for that. But just a few stats. So of all of the parcels, the 8,000 parcels, 22% were determined to be vacant lots. Of all of the buildings, that was about 5,250 buildings, so 5,250 or so of those 8,000 parcels had a building on them. Of those buildings, 13% were vacant. 72% of all of the parcels, all those 8,000 parcels, had a sidewalk in front of it. Of those that had a sidewalk, only 54 were in good condition. We noticed actually that there were quite a few parcels here in Little Rock that did not have a sidewalk in front of them. But anyway, that's all really important information to be gathering when we're out in the field doing something like this. 17% of the study area had high or landmark character buildings. That is really fantastic. And that is on a scale of low, medium, high, and landmark architectural character. So 17% were really extraordinary buildings here. And 69% of all of the buildings in the study area were in good or very good condition, which is pretty great. And that's on a scale of very poor, fair, good, and very good. So a whopping nearly 70% were good or very good. Encourage you to stay tuned for what comes out and look forward to hearing more from you. But we have to go present this to the board this afternoon. And so thank you very much. This was really a pleasure to speak with you all and to do this project here in Little Rock.
So now, questions, comments, alternative view, go back to Washington, you communists, any of those are perfectly all right.
And please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. We'll start at that back table. 1 second.
In doing the survey and your research from that, how did Little Rock compare to other locations that you've done in terms of the number of buildings that were good and all of the categories?
I'll just talk off the head. I think that, and Emilie just identified it, I think that the percentage that in fact were good or very good condition was higher than we often see. I mean, inherently, this is not a tool that you go to the brand new neighborhood and everything's in great shape. So they're all kind of struggling neighborhoods. So I think the condition, the share that was in high condition was good. I think that the number of vacant lots depend, again, because we have all aggregated, when you disaggregate those 5 areas, there's, in many cases, way too many vacant lots. And again, that's not uncommon in situations, but it's a thing that's a kind of heads up. I think the other thing, and again, we couldn't show you the numbers, but the really surprising thing was in our surveys, we also, in the community survey, we also broke down from people who lived in the neighborhood and who didn't. So we could kind of make those comparisons. What's very interesting is that the things that really important to people made no difference. There was no difference between people who lived. The people who lived in this area gave a greater importance to things like walkability, like places to gather, a greater sense of community engagement on knowing their neighbors as compared to the city as a whole. And again, I can't, because we always tinker with this survey, I can't exactly compare those with other places, but it was kind of really interesting results. And here's my cheating reveal. Mostly the people in this area were quite pleased with the characteristics of their neighborhood. So not that they didn't see anything's wrong, but when you saw what we didn't like or wasn't good, it was pretty consistent with what people in the rest of Little Rock were saying, but with 2 exceptions on the downside. not enough parks and not enough grocery stores relative to what people in the other parts of the city said. So,
In the back again. 1 second. 1 second, please.
I have, thank you. I have three questions. In your opening remarks, you made reference.
Sir, will you turn the microphone on? I think it got flipped off.
Hello?
Thanks.
In your opening remarks, you made reference to, and correct me if I'm wrong here too, in migration and its effect on the environment. Could you clarify what I thought I heard and further expand on the definition and effect? Could you also identify the eastern boundary of your study area? And finally, can you give us the total number, if not total, close but not quite, of the number of recommendations that you plan to forward to the board, and whether or not the board is obligated to follow any of those recommendations?
I'll take the first one and half of the last one, and I'll give half of the last one and the second one to Emilie. Yes, we use recent in-migration, particularly international in-migration, as a precursor to an emergence of entrepreneurialism. That often when people are moving in, regardless of kind of the political discussions of the day, when internationals are moving in, and it kind of doesn't matter if they're moving in from Somalia or from India or from Korea or from Mexico. In fact, very frequently, that in migration they'll come, they'll take a job doing, plucking chickens or something early, and spend a couple of years and saying, you know what, I have something to add and will be a big startup. So we really view that as a precursor to a kind of emerging economic kind of entrepreneurialism in the neighborhood. So we give it, we have high scores. So that's what that is. I'll skip to the second half of your last question. Is we will have recommendations, and Emilie will, and so we'll have recommendations on every vacant building and vacant parcel. Obviously, the city is under no obligation at all to do it. Every indication we have is because they were the client, they really want to have a more informed decision on where to spend scarce resources, but there's nothing we can do to twist their arm and say, you got to do it. So you can do the boundary question.
Sure, yeah. So I just wanted to bring this back up here. This is Main Street, Roosevelt, I-30, I think this is 17th, coming up along what are like railroad tracks right there, and Capitol Ave. Does that answer your question? And then to the number of recommendations, and we can reveal this, right? So of the nearly 8,000 parcels, about 2,400, just a few over 2,400 vacant buildings and or vacant lots. And I believe it was a breakdown of about 650 and 1,750, something like that. Thank you.
Over here.
Thank you. So your areas were a priori designated. So did they hold up when the data came in? Were they cohesive internally? Could you make comparisons from one to the other?
I'll answer part of it, and Emilie will answer part of it. They were, because we didn't want to be the ones drawing the lines in a city that we didn't know. And the lines were, and Brian, in conjunction with kind of discussions, drew the lines, and we lived with them. Sometimes, frankly, the lines were drawn to make the data collection easier, so that they were drawn, for example, along a census tract line or something, so that there was clarity. And I don't think anybody, ever intended, well, these are going to be the absolute, but it was just a way to get started in that. So that's the general framework. And then I'll let Emilie talk about how the fuzziness happened, particularly next to some of the commercial areas and others, and what we did about that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so especially since this is Main Street, right, and sort of half falls here and half falls here, that definitely, was something that we had to bear in mind and be cognizant of. And of course, we had the commercial area of Wright Ave, we had MLK here, so there were lots of kind of commercial areas that were really interesting, and we actually ended up splitting kind of the Main Street into Central and splitting Main Street into East. So the benefits really of what's happening on Main Street, which is really incredible, sort of benefited both sub areas, and we recognize that there are size differences, but really at the end of the day, when we're comparing sub area to sub area, it really balanced out, I think, in the long run. Is there anything else you wanted me to touch on?
No, but under this last point of Emily's is that it's where we try to be very disciplined about the recommendations. And we try to let what's happening in a sub area influence the individual parcel decisions. But along Main Street, it was just unfair to some properties to do that in an absolute fashion, because as Emily said, that the positive influence of Main Street slops over to both Central and East, and if you only said, well, let's only be driven solely by the East characteristics or by Central's, you'd get a distorted view. So frankly, and it wasn't like thousands of properties, but we took some saying, we need to take a breath, step back, and say that there's other things going on, kind of what made some properties almost a victim of that line, and we tried to accommodate that. Well, and the other thing I got to say, that it is those kind of things, while this is data-based and objective, it also suggests you couldn't exactly substitute it as a computer doing it. That it does need the human input, both from the field surveys, from the community survey, and frankly, our kind of trying to balance that. Not throwing out data, but saying, what does this really mean?
Hello. I did a little bit of volunteering with you. My phone didn't keep me on the working with you. But one thing is, when you have your publication out, we can all get access to it, correct? By going to the city or the historic.
Yes.
And
We'll wave it at you. Yes.
okay. And two, since this did not have my neighborhood on it, I was wondering, and I'm part of my neighborhood association, like, how will this help us try to figure out how to use the tools that you have to maybe figure this out? Is there apps that we can use? Like the survey that you had that went out, I did the monkey survey. Like for my neighborhood, I would love to have something like that, but of course we can't hire you. How does this help us?
Well, one of the things, and actually we just had a great lunch with a handful of grad students here just before coming here. Yeah, you can. It kind of doesn't make sense, but we're very transparent about here's the 75 metrics or whatever it is with a description of each. And I think that a whole lot of this, in fact, you could say we really think that these 6 or 7 are really important. We ought to look at those data points for our neighborhood, and you can pull them out. I don't know that we put the survey questions in here, but we'd be happy to share that. Happy to share what, in fact, the question. You could duplicate the survey on SurveyMonkey for free, and we'd be more than happy to do that. So we had a client and we got paid, and this was the area, but we'd be thrilled if people said we can take a little piece of this and use it for other fashions.
Absolutely.
Jenna, and then come to you.
Thank you so much for coming. This is a real interest of mine as a Clinton School alum and working with the City of North Little Rock on community development and economic development. So I'm curious if you could speak to the replicability of this without hiring a firm, because we can't. So how we would do what you did. There are 2 neighborhoods that I'm working with that I can see real potential opportunity to use kind of what you've done. And then also, could you speak to, I guess I would consider it a bit of low community participation in terms of 200 surveys returned, 8,000 properties, and how do you see that, and what bias do you think that kind of inserted into the outcomes, and how do you account for that? Thank you.
Well, I think that I think the replicability really is not trying to say we want to do exactly what they did and do it for on our own, but I think what's more important is the concept of saying there's a wide range of kind of urban quality indicators for which there is data. And tap a class at the Clinton School, so you have some kind of grinding stuff out. But I think a lot of it is, and that's again, you can literally look at each of the metrics we used in a little paragraph description and see the data sources for those to see it. So I think you could really create your own to say we can't afford, we don't want to do that, but we want to be more objective about our decision making. Here's how to. Some things we can do it. So I think you can do that. The second part, as to the survey stuff, just statistically, I was not unhappy with the 200. Now, is that enough to kind of predict the presidential election? No, again, statistically, but it gave enough of a pattern of it and a trend where I feel comfortable with it. It was sufficient that we, in some instances, we changed our weightings within sub-area groups because of a particularly strong either for or indifference to a given metric. So we tried to reflect that, and we made those changes. The last time we did this in Cincinnati, in the same process, in fact, we didn't make any changes because there was no significant difference among the sub-area groups. Here there was, and so we changed the weighting. I guess it is really in the purpose that you see the survey, in that when we originally added this survey component to Relocal, it was literally to help us weight our measures. It's really only after we've done it a few times saying, ooh, there's some other cool stuff coming out of here. Again, I don't mean that it's statistically significant to 14 decimal points, but it gives a general pattern that, yeah, walkability is really important. Jobs in the neighborhood is not so important. And I think the kind of broad patterns are useful. We didn't, and the question was, were there demographic indicators? There was age, there was sex, there was not race, there was not income, and that really was kind of conscious, that we didn't want to, to kind of be lumped together. So we could make some reasonable assumptions about both race and income based on where the respondents performed, but we really didn't. The only ones we used was age, and then we used others, length of time in the neighborhood and those kind of things. But race and income we did not ask, and wouldn't the next time.
Right here.
May I just add one more thing? I just wanted to say, again, with the smartphone surveys, what we told the grad students too, it really is an excellent opportunity to engage locally in gathering data. And there are multiple tools available to use it, some free. If you're working with the city, you may have access to an Esri account. There is a collector app. It's called a collector app. Through Esri. So there are opportunities to kind of rally people on a weekend and really hit the streets and gather data. So I just wanted to hammer that home. Yeah.
Hey, Don. Hey. A couple of the boundaries of the sub-areas, I think it was Central and North Central, correspond approximately with the city's two protected historic districts, MacArthur Park and then the Governor's Mansion District. Were those historic district boundaries part of the data collection, and did you find that decades of preservation policy in those neighborhoods made any difference in their livability and walkability and viability and all those abilities?
They did. Well, and both on the input and on the outcome. In that one of the few preservation measures that we had is it an historic district? So that was a measure that would show up there. But as you'll see when we disaggregate all the data, then a whole lot of other elements then emerge from those. Now we didn't report on a level other than these sub areas, but you can kind of figure it out. But yeah, a whole range of things. You can see that those in fact did significantly better on a whole range of measures than the area as a whole. And so.
Hey, Don. Because, kind of following up on that last question, because historic districts tend to stabilize neighborhoods, did you, based on just reconnaissance surveys that we did, were there findings that said, this area does have potential for a historic district, whether it be local or national?
And Emily can add. Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, our goal was not necessarily to determine whether there's an opportunity for a local or a national register historic district, but the data that was collected can certainly be utilized by our partners in whatever way they see fit to either support that or kind of lead down that direction. Yeah.
The other thing that we should say, by the way, in terms of transparency, is our deal with Brian is we're turning over all of our shape files. And for those of you like me who don't know shape files from the shape of the moon, they are these kind of collections that do map visualization of numerical data. And so we're turning all of that over. And so the things like, and then from that will emerge things like building character, building condition, building quality. And so that could really be used. You just sort the data differently. And all of that's will be in the city's hands, so it's certainly available as a resource. Yeah.
I've been involved since 1998 in and out of the, future Little Rock and what have you, MacArthur Park group. And I want to know if you've addressed these lots that you have is one thing, the rehabilitation of the houses is another, the historic district is another. Have you come up with any ways that you can look at this from an economic perspective for a builder to come in? It's one thing to take a vacant lot and go up and fix it. It's another to go in and tear out and put back. And a lot of things that you want to go in and tear up and put back, you take this board off and you found something you didn't even know was behind there, and da-da-da-da-da until you've got an enormous amount of money in a property that you never figured on doing, and then you can't find a market to move it. So do you have anything addressing all of that?
Well, yeah, in the end, you'd almost have to do that on a more in-depth, evaluation of the building than would ever be possible in this kind of approach. Having said that, and I come from the real estate world, so I'm sympathetic to the kind of risk and reward and all of that. What we have done for all of the vacant properties, this continuum of saying these are the ones that ought to be rehabbed, these are the ones that ought to go. In part, that's in recognition. The ones, frankly, on the higher end are those that are going to be both higher quality and in better condition. That doesn't mean it's risk-free, but it's risk mitigated on that end. The second thing that's part of that equation is we absolutely do take into consideration not just the parcel, but the block and the neighborhood from an economic and a physical standpoint. And so for the sake of argument, two identical buildings in the same condition in two different places, one might very well have the recommendation, rehab this one, demolish this one, because of the consideration of, if this is the only building left in surrounded by 3 blocks of vacant lots, you're not going to, I don't care how, you get it done cheaply, you're not going to be able to find a market for that one. This one in the, middle of a place where the property values are stable and very few vacancies is one where there's a great opportunity to meet the market. So that's on that side. The second level of that is what we have done is calculate the spending power in each of these sub areas. And many of, 4 of 5 of these, or 3 of 5 of these, I'm telling you, are going to be written off by a lot of chain store site selection people saying, all those people are poor, there's no economic opportunity. And that just ain't so. That in fact, there's a whole bunch of buying power in those neighborhoods, so there's real latent economic opportunity across the board, and all of that numbers is there too. The last element, again, we're learning as we go. We originally thought that our client for the information would be cities spending their money. What we've learned in earlier tasks is that there are other constituencies, including the kind of real estate world, who's saying, well, a whole bunch of our stuff has been done, of saying where the sites are most appropriate for infill or for rehabilitation, where there's a strong enough market to support additions to the market. And so we think that that's an opportunity as well. No, can I say, I can guarantee you that house is not going to cost you more than $92 a foot to rehab. I can't do it. But I think in general patterns, you'll be able to say, these are the ones that at least my risk is less than trying to tackle these. And frankly, the ones that we said these are go are the ones that are so far gone on the deferred maintenance scale and of so nominal character and quality that we say if some got to go and some do, it ought to be those.
Well, we ran out of time, and I know that there's still more questions, so please come up and talk with Don and Emily after the event. Thank you to Rhea and Vanessa and Brian and City of Little Rock and all others that helped bring you guys to Little Rock, and thank all of you for being so interested in the topic. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you.